At the time of the outbreak of the pandemic in the USA, I, Jim Young, had been married to my wife Lisa Montrose. Her father persuaded her to keep her maiden name when we got married, and I didn't mind. For 11 years, and we had two children aged 7 and 9. I worked in information technology while Lisa worked in local government in Northern Virginia. To understand my story, it is not necessary to go into details, although a few interesting facts about Lisa's family are important. Lisa is very close to her father, Winston, who never liked me, and is also close to her mother, Crystal, who is at odds with her father and hates her stepmother, Karen. Karen is much younger than Winston, only 3 years older than Lisa and me, and Lisa considers Karen a money hunter. Deep down, I think Lisa doesn't like Karen because Karen is really good looking, but she has poor self-esteem, or at least she had one. Surprisingly, Crystal and Karen got along much better than Lisa and Karen. They're actually friends. I got along well with both Crystal and Karen, but I hate Winston just as much, if not more, than he hates me. I think Winston is an asshole and a braggart, and I don't like the way he treats Crystal and Karen, and he doesn't like me primarily because I confront him and tell him off to his face for the way he treats Crystal and Karen. If he could kick my ass, he would, but he can't, if only because I'm twice as strong as him and he's not a martial arts expert. Even though I like Karen, I have a problem with her. She's damn beautiful. Each person has their own characteristics of the opposite sex that attract them. Karen has everything I like. I wish she had a nasty temper so I could write her off, but she's kind and smart. I've never been able to figure out how that asshole Winston convinced her to marry him. 3 years ago. Despite my passion for Karen, I believe I have properly hidden it from everyone. Since I do most of the id work for a consulting firm specializing in helping restaurants and retailers, as expected, as soon as the closure orders were issued, I was fired. Although our family is financially responsible, we did not have the savings to last more than 6 months without my at least some kind of monetary contribution. So I started looking for another job where they would pay decently, although, obviously, not as much as in my job. But at the same time, they allowed I wish I could at least help with the children's home schooling. It turned out that most of the jobs that became available were related to the fight against the pandemic, and I liked the contact tracking job the most. Contact tracing is part of the process of helping patients with suspected infection or with a confirmed diagnosis. Vacancies for specialists in all infectious diseases, especially sexually transmitted diseases, have been around for a long time. But due to the pandemic, the demand for them has increased significantly. Typically, during a pandemic, Contact Tracker works with those who have tested positive for the new coronavirus to help them remember everyone they had close contact with during the period when they may have been infected. Then, the contact tracking system warns the contacted persons about their potential infection as quickly and delicately as possible without identifying the person who is infectious, and tests the potentially contacted persons for diseases. Knowledge of information technology can help with contact tracking, as most of the work is done electronically, including using mobile phone and social media data, especially for patients who don't seem to be very honest about disclosing information about everyone they had close contact with. So I was hired after a couple of days after the outbreak of the pandemic. When I applied, my training in contact tracing was relatively short and accelerated due to necessity, as well as because I had good abilities and experience in this field. So I started working 2 weeks after I was hired. I found this to be a useful job, especially when contact persons were checked and identified at an early stage, which increased their chances of recovery. It was sad to see some contacts or patients die, but since I'm not really a medical professional, I've never had to see this pain up close. For about 2 months, everything went pretty smoothly in my family. Lisa said that she still has to go to the office sometimes, and I also had to do some field work, but we were able to do most of our work at home using Skype, Zoom, phone calls, text messages, email, and other forms of electronic communication. We arranged our schedules so that 95% of the time, at least one of us was at home with the children and moved on to their homeschooling using the resources provided by the school our children went to. Even the three of us were sitting at our laptops at the same time, and sometimes all four of us. Those 5% of the time when one of us was not with the children, Crystal or Karen, both local and kept 2 steps away from the children, replaced us just so that someone would be at our house in case of an emergency. Our lives were happy in the face of the pandemic, especially since Lisa and I were at home together more often, and there was something about this situation that made it exciting. We could pretend that we're one of the few couples stuck on Mars, and we need to populate the planet. She giggled one night when she went to bed. I knew she was protected because I had seen the bill for Depop just 2 weeks earlier, but I played along with her. That is, our lives were as happy as possible during the pandemic until 2 days after the epic lovemaking session described above. I was assigned John Upton as a patient. I was unhappy with John's answers when I talked to him on the phone. I felt like he was hiding something. I stressed to him the importance of being frank with me and arranged a personal meeting. When I met John, we were in the park 2 meters apart from each other. I was not wearing a special suit, but I had an antivirus mask, gloves, a protective face mask, and a paper robe. He was wearing a mask too, so I couldn't really see his face, but I thought I recognized his eyes. It turned out that he worked in the building next to Lisa's house, so maybe I saw him in the area. He talked for a while, and I started harassing him to get him to tell me everything. The last statement that prompted him to do this was this: if you don't tell me about someone, and later it turns out that he died of an illness when he could have been saved if he had been helped earlier, this will turn into a police investigation, and you may be charged with manslaughter. I have no idea if this statement was correct, but I assumed it was, so I didn't hesitate to tell him if it would make him open up. After a pause, during which he stared at the floor, Upton looked up and said, "Now everything I say is confidential, right? All you can do is ask someone to take the test and say that I am not the source." "Absolutely," I replied, because that's how it should be. When he finally opened up, he became an ordinary chatterbox Katie. After he gave me a list of about 10 people, told me about his relationship and last contact, with an exact date if possible, with each of them, as well as their contact information. As far as he knew, he stopped. I could say that wasn't all. "Look, John, I know you're hiding something. Everything will remain confidential, so I need information. Remember what I said about the police investigation?" I chided. Upton sighed, and then, without looking me in the eye, he said, "I recently had a bad relationship with 2 married women who, I believe, kept in touch with their husbands and children. One of them is Martha L. Well, and the other is Lisa Montrose." Because Upton was looking down, he didn't notice how I looked up from my iPad when he said my wife's name. Since my last name was different from hers, he obviously didn't even think that Lisa Montrose's husband might be Jim Young. Showing more restraint than I've ever shown in my life, I first pretended that I was having problems with my iPad, turned on the recorder, and then asked him to repeat what he had just said, which he did. Then I started asking him about both women. "How long did you have a bed relationship with Martha L.?" "Well," I asked, staring at my iPad. Why is this so important?" "What is it?" he asked stupidly. "Because setting the exact date of infection is not an exact science, and since bed relationships lead to the disease manifesting in different ways," was my deadpan and deceitful answer. "Since October last year, when the disease was not even known in China, you don't need more, do you?" he replied. "No, that's good," I replied, feeling sweat start to show under my protective mask. I asked him a few more questions about Martha L. Well, and then moved on to what was most. "How long did you have a bed relationship with Lisa Montrose?" "Last year, just before Christmas." "When was the last time you had sex with Lisa Montrose?" 5 days ago." "How many times have you made love to Lisa Montrose from the beginning of last year before Christmas to the present?" I don't remember exactly," Upton replied. Maybe 8 or 9 times. Where did you make love to her? Every time it was in my apartment, which is located a block from the buildings where we work. She showed up at her office for a while and then came to me. He replied in a voice that made my skin crawl because he was so cheerful and cheerful as if he was recalling pleasant memories. Was anyone else present? No, just Lisa and me. Although the last time she said that she would think about having a threesome with Martha or my brother if he could get out of prison in New York, I cringed, sweated even harder, and felt my throat tighten. After a few seconds, I got over it. I wanted to ask a few more questions, but that would probably give me away. At the stage I was at, I could justify what I had asked for so far and what else I really needed. I turned off the recorder and grumbled. Thanks for being honest. I will be in touch, and do not forget to avoid contact with everyone until you receive a health certificate so as not to infect others. This is especially true for Martha and Lisa. If their test turns out to be positive, will I be able to make love to them? He actually asked, showing what a complete asshole he was. Not until you all come to your senses, I chuckled. Fortunately, secular greetings and goodbyes no longer allowed handshakes because if I had touched him, I would most likely have killed him and gone to jail for it. After warning him, I just turned around and left. On the way home, I experienced more contradictions than I had ever experienced in my life. I was obliged to keep the information I received from Upton a secret, but how could I have not noticed the betrayal of my bitch wife, who may have infected my children with the new coronavirus? By the time I got home, a plan had formed in my head. The first step was to inform everyone Upton had been in contact with about the possibility of infection, and the second was to conduct an examination of my family. Within an hour, I called or emailed everyone Upton knew except Lisa. When I talked to Martha Elwell, she was particularly upset. Is John Upton the person who tested positive? She sobbed into the phone. I'm sorry, Mrs. Elwell, but I can't name this man. If you have any suspicions that this is John Upton, you should ask him directly, I replied. I hope that the fact that I repeated his name in response, and even underlined it, would be enough for her to check. I was hoping that somehow she would find a way to hurt him. Because I worked for the Department of Health, I was able to get my family tested immediately, including Karen, Winston, and Crystal. By immediately, I mean the same day that the most accurate test that could have been performed, and which was performed within an hour, was performed. Lisa, me, both children, and Karen tested positive. Winston and Crystal did not, although they were given 2 different tests. After the consultation, despite Lisa's objections, we decided that Karen should move in with us during the quarantine period. I realized that I couldn't be polite to Lisa, so I tried to just ignore her. This made her especially angry when I was extremely nice to Karen by helping her move into the guest room. When we went to bed, Lisa attacked me. Why are you acting like a jerk, like you're blaming me, when it's more likely that you're the source of a new infection in our family? Really? I growled. I have not had extramarital lovemaking with an infected person. Can you say the same thing? She flinched, but then came to her senses. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She snapped. I do not know, Lisa. You're a smart woman. You'll figure it out for yourself, but do it in silence. I have no desire to interact with you in any way. How dare you? She began. That's all she had time to say before I grabbed her face and said with a low growl, shut up, words I've never used with her before and never even thought to use. If you infected our children, it will hurt you a lot. She ran into the bathroom in tears. My conscience was clear, and I knew how I would react depending on what happened to the virus, so I slept for 7 whole hours. When I woke up the next morning, Lisa was lying on our bed as far away from me as possible, awake, but with bleary eyes. When she saw me getting out of bed, it became obvious that she had changed her attitude to what was happening. Jim, can we please talk? As soon as everything related to the virus goes away, not before. So don't ask anymore. I snapped. As I was involved in this case, I couldn't track my family's contacts. However, I asked the children and Karen about what they had told the contact tracing specialist, and all three of them had practically no contact with anyone other than the family. In addition, all my friends were wearing protective clothing, which left me in no doubt, although I already had no doubt, that Lisa was the source of infection in our family. Over the next few days, there was both justice and injustice in this case. This is a very important thing to do. In the next few days, Lisa developed serious symptoms within 2 days of being examined. As a result, she ended up in the intensive care unit of the hospital. Moreover, Karen, my son, and I had no symptoms, and all our vital signs were positive, and, according to our doctor, we are likely to remain so. Injustice. My little girl was not feeling well the day Lisa was admitted to the intensive care unit, and the next day she was also admitted to the hospital. Good evening. When my son went to bed, Karen and I had a long conversation. Jim, you're probably wondering why. Despite my positive test result, Winston doesn't have it, Karen said. I thought it was just luck, I replied. There's probably more to it than that, she chuckled. We haven't been close for months. I know you don't like him, and over the last year I figured out why you don't, and to be honest, I almost hate him now. I should have listened to Crystal when she told me not to marry him. Her last statement stunned me. I was slightly, but not completely, surprised by the rest of her statement. Are you going to divorce him? I asked. Yes, it is. As soon as society returns to normal, that will probably be the first thing I will do, she replied. What about you and Lisa? I was a little surprised by this question. What do you mean? I think you know. You somehow found out that Lisa was cheating on you. What makes you think that, Karen? The way you reacted to her and treated her when you told me about the possibility of new coronavirus infections in the family told me about it. In addition, and I apologize for not telling you about this earlier, last Christmas, I overheard part of Lisa's conversation on her mobile phone, which aroused my suspicions. And during the pandemic, events occurred that strengthened me in this opinion, Karen replied. If I get some evidence that I can use, I'll go the same way as you, I replied. Her mobile is here. Can a tech guy like you learn something from it? She smiled, handing me Lisa's mobile phone. I raised my eyebrows in surprise, and then hesitantly took Lisa's cell phone from her. I'll take a look, just to make sure she was honest with the contact finder about who she has. I smiled. Of course it was a lie. I wanted to know if she had talked to Upton and other potential buddies on the phone. As an information technology specialist, I hacked her password, which took about 8 minutes, and got into her phone. There were quite a few canceled messages and emails. About 3 hours later, I stayed up late that night. I managed to discover explicit correspondence with Upton and 2 other potential hookup buddies, with the first of whom Lisa apparently stopped communicating 18 months ago, and with the second, with whom Lisa apparently stopped communicating about 9 months ago. Using Lisa's phone, I sent messages to both guys I considered potential hookup partners, asking if they wanted to resume a relationship. The first one never answered. The second one, Josh Martin, replied the next day. After exchanging about 20 messages, I arranged with him to meet Lisa about a couple of kilometers from my house after sunset. Martin was stupid enough to send me a recent photo of himself so that I would know what he looked like. In fact, I knew more about him than I would have liked. After searching on social media, I found out that he is also married. Before my meeting with Martin, there was a little more justice. After my daughter was given an experimental drug that seemed to work well on children, she returned home from the hospital. Karen, my son, and I were tested again, and we still tested positive, but without any symptoms, and our doctor repeated what she had told us earlier. She did not expect us to ever have symptoms, and we would be fine after the quarantine period. Lisa was still in the hospital on a ventilator. Karen looked after the kids while I went to Lisa's meeting with Josh Martin. Karen promised to provide me with an alibi if I needed one and to support me if I wanted to talk about it. Nowadays, when people wear masks, safety glasses, and other face masking devices, it is very easy to hide their identity. Therefore, Martin was completely unperturbed when someone wearing a mask and goggles approached him in the park that I had set up for a meeting. By the time he realized something was wrong, I had him in a chokehold. Using a voice-altering device and hiding the microphone under a mask, I explained the matter to Martin. "Josh, I assume you want to live. If you want, nod your head, because the pressure I'm putting on your neck right now probably doesn't allow you to answer clearly." He nodded his head as vigorously as he could. "I'm going to loosen my grip just enough for you to talk. If you try to break free, I'll strangle you." "Okay." He nodded again, and I loosened my grip slightly and turned on the recorder. "Did you have an affair with Lisa Montrose?" "Yes." "When did it start, and when did it end?" "It started about a year and a half ago and ended about 9 months ago." I continued to ask about how it all started and ended. Who was the aggressor? Were they met? At what time and how many breaks they had? In conclusion, I said, "Now I'm going to strangle you until you lose consciousness. You'll be unconscious for about 20 seconds, and then you'll come to your senses. If you ever talk to Lisa again, you won't come to your senses next time." "Understood." He nodded his head. "Besides, if you tell anyone about our meeting, your wife will know about what you just told me. If you keep quiet, she won't know it." "Understood?" He nodded again. I strangled him until he lost consciousness, and then I left. As soon as I got home, I threw all my outerwear in the neighbor's trash can and deleted all recent messages to and from Martin so that they could not be restored. The next day, another form of justice appeared. My big boss at my job called me and told me that my immediate boss had decided to retire, and he offered me this job with immediate opening, especially since some restaurants and other businesses in other regions of the country, where we also did business, resumed their work. Since most of my work could be done at home if I came out of quarantine within the next week or so, which was expected, I was ready to work. He really appreciated my contact tracking experience, which I still did part-time at home, as a positive one. That evening, when the children went to bed, another form of justice took place. Karen sat me down in the living room and asked me to tell her about Lisa. I sighed heavily and then told her about John Upton, without revealing that I had received confidential information from contact tracking, but only information that I had received from her mobile phone, Josh Martin, and a third guy whom I suspected, but about whom I had no reliable information. She was very responsive. Then I switched roles with Karen and asked her about her situation with my father-in-law, Winston. She readily talked about all the problems she had with him. She also said that these were the problems that Crystal had, and that was why Crystal divorced him. Karen couldn't believe she was naive enough to marry Winston, but he caught her at a very vulnerable time in her life, when her first husband had just died and she had no self-esteem. Now that she was feeling better, there was no doubt that she was going to divorce Winston. "So, what conclusion can be drawn about you and Lisa?" Karen asked. "I don't see any way to keep the marriage with her. I think I can get physical custody of the children because she put their lives in danger by having an affair with John Upton, who tested positive for the new coronavirus. But anyway, how can I stay married when she's had at least 2 affairs, and maybe in more? And what are you going to do to diffuse in light of your divorce?" Karen asked in a very passionate voice, stroking me with her index finger. I smiled broadly. "I'll have to find someone else, but not for one night, but someone I can love." "Are you accepting candidates for this job?" she asked, looking into my eyes and stroking me. "It's too good to be true," flashed through my mind. I hesitated for a few seconds, while she continued to look at me more into my soul than just into my eyes. There was no choice. I imprinted on her lips the most passionate kiss I was capable of. She returned the kiss just as passionately. When we broke off the kiss, I grinned. "You're a damn good kisser." As soon as she came to her senses, a devilish grin appeared on her face. She put me completely on the bed, and with more force than I thought she was capable of, turned me over on my back. That's when I realized what she meant when she bragged. This woman must have been doing Kegel exercises all her life. In the end, we both lay in silence. Karen was lying on top of me. I experienced the most intense euphoria I have ever experienced in my life. Sometime later, she rolled off me and smiled when we were face to face. "You know exactly how to back up your bragging," I chuckled. After we exchanged a few more kisses, she giggled. "I bet you do." I laughed. "If you have some lube, I'll prove it," she retorted back. I went to the bathroom and got some lotion. When I woke up the next morning, Karen was gone. I knew this would happen. She loved my children as if they were her own, and she wouldn't want them to see her. In my bed, when I got my ass out of bed, still euphoric and at the same time devastated by the phenomenal experience of the previous evening, both the kids and Karen were laughing in the kitchen. Karen and I hugged Chase Lee and kissed on the cheek when I growled something in her ear, as a result of which she playfully slapped me in mouth. Children shouldn't know. Of course, she was right. After I hugged and tickled each child, Karen said, "If you want toast and oatmeal, have a seat," which I did. Karen and I played hide and seek under the table while we ate and chatted with the kids. When breakfast was finished, I cleared the table and either washed or put all the pans, plates, and glasses in the dishwasher while Karen took the children outside to study before going online or doing homework. I worked in the morning while Karen was busy with the kids, and then I cooked lunch. After lunch, she sent the children to play in the backyard where we could look after them and once again warn them not to communicate with other children. As we stood side by side watching the children through the kitchen window, I hugged her. "You're a goddess," I muttered, nibbling on her earlobe. Did I do well enough to have my application seriously considered? She giggled. "Let's just say," I replied, biting my earlobe. "If last night was a test, then you got an A+ indefinitely. As soon as I kick the traitor out, I want you to live with me all the time more than anything in the world," I sighed. We both smiled at each other and exchanged a quick kiss. For the remaining 7 days of our quarantine, Karen and I slept in the same bed at night, until about 5:30 am when she returned to the guest room. I would like to say that we slept together, but that would be a wrong term. Since most of the time we spent in bed together, we hardly slept. Karen and I seemed not only compatible, but also attuned to each other. Despite what was going on in my marriage and the pandemic, it was the best week of my life. The only profession that was still functioning during the pandemic, despite the rare and usually virtual appearances in the courts, were lawyers. I had a good friend, a lawyer, and he introduced me to Susan Shark. Her real name is Sharpton, but everyone calls her Shark, and she had no problem with that, because she is as restless and vicious as a tiger shark, a divorce specialist at his firm. Electronically, I gave Susan the information I had received from Lisa's mobile phone, which pointed to Martin in Upton. I didn't tell her about my personal contact with Upton because it was confidential information, but I expressed a desire to find out if he was the source of infection in our family. I gave her a recording of what Martin told me, but since it was obtained from him under duress, she said we couldn't use it, although we could call him to testify if the case went to trial. We could use the information about the mobile phone, since both my mobile phone and Lisa's phone were registered on the same account with the telecom operator, and I usually paid the bills for both. Susan believed that I could retain ownership of the house and get physical custody of the children, provided that Lisa and I had joint legal custody. If she could prove that Lisa was so reckless that she contracted the disease from Upton and passed it on to the children, I advised Susan to file for divorce on the basis of irreconcilable differences, the only basis recognized in Virginia where we lived, although adultery can be used to prove irreconcilability. I plan to take her to court a day or two after she gets out of the hospital. Karen also used Susan to prepare the divorce papers, which had to be filed immediately. As soon as the quarantine was lifted, Karen, the children, and I had negative test results. Karen did not return to Winston's house. She told him that I needed help with the kids, especially since I had to go to work for a few hours every day to do tasks that I couldn't do at home. Karen even refused Winston when he begged, whined, and threatened, demanding her return. A day later, he was handed the divorce papers. 3 days after the end of the quarantine, Lisa was discharged from the hospital. I told Winston on the phone that I was picking her up and taking her to his house to stay. What are you talking about? What is it? He asked. I'm divorcing your daughter, and she needs a place to stay, so I'll give her a ride to your house. I'll bring the kids to visit her early tonight. I hung up before he could answer. When I took Lisa away, it was not surprising that she had lost a lot of weight and she had nothing much to lose when she was admitted to the hospital. After we took off our masks in the car, she bent down to kiss me, but I turned my head, and her lips touched my cheek. A strange expression appeared on her face, and she said, "It seemed to me that you didn't make much effort to contact me at the hospital. I know that the rules related to the disease did not allow you to see me, but I was expecting some kind of electronic communication. I've tried to get the kids to contact you as often as possible." I snapped. "But you didn't do it," she snapped. "I didn't see the need for that since I'm going to divorce you," I replied dryly. "What the fuck?" she growled. "Why?" "Because you've made love to Josh Martin, John Upton, and probably others. You probably contracted the disease that you passed on to the rest of the family, including sending our daughter to the hospital from one of your lovers." I snapped back. Lisa was silent for a while. "Why do you think that? Your phone says it all by itself." I chuckled, although there was nothing funny about it. After a long pause, Lisa asked, "Are you ready to throw away 11 years of marriage and expose our children to the stress of divorce because of a couple of fleeting hobbies that meant nothing?" I chuckled. "They meant something to me. I'll drop you off at your dad's house." When we arrived at his house, Lisa did not want to get out of the car, but I finally persuaded her to get out, saying that I would bring the children early in the evening. I was a really nice guy and helped her up the steps to Dad's front door. From that moment on, he took over. If his looks could kill, I'd be dead. But instead, he just grumbled something about being glad to get rid of Karen and me. Of course, there were some skirmishes before everything settled down. At first, Winston and Lisa made a fuss about challenging the divorces. However, we submitted a report by a contact tracing expert in which it was determined with a 90% probability that Upton was the source of infection of our family with the new coronavirus. 2. Crystal supported Karen's accusations of emotional abuse by Winston. 3. The whole family found out that the delay in paying insurance led to Upton becoming the source of infection of our family with the new coronavirus. What Karen received as a result of the death of her first husband equalized her financial capabilities with Winston's finances, so she did not ask him for any money. 4. Karen gave me enough money to buy out Lisa's share in our house and became my mortgagee. 5. According to the results of a survey conducted by a child psychologist, Karen was an excellent role model and mother to children. 6. I have agreed to leave Lisa with the children for 2 nights a week since she moved out of Winston's house and began to live separately. Agreements were reached in both divorces. Society returned to a new normal when divorces became final on the same day. The very next day, Karen and I got married in the presence of a justice of the peace. I was a Crystal and my brother were witnesses and went on a 10-day honeymoon to Aruba, while Crystal and Lisa took turns looking after the children. There were only 2 problems on this honeymoon. 1. I started to get jealous when Karen was on the beach topless on Renaissance Island, because so many guys were staring at her. 2. Karen almost used me to death. But what a way out if she wanted to. In fact, the whole year that has passed since our honeymoon seemed to be a continuation of it. The children seem to have adapted well to each other, and Karen and I have never been so happy in our lives. P.S. John Upton had serious irreversible consequences of the disease, including persistent breathing problems. So far, I haven't heard anything about Josh Martin. End.